In this tutorial, we'll go through the entire process from creating a non-destructive and editable title with geometry nodes, adding materials, lighting, animation, rendering, and compositing, all inside of this wonderful free software we all know and love, Blender. You can grab this as a template alongside other project files from previous videos that cost very little but help a lot with running this channel. Or you could learn how to create it from scratch by following along with this tutorial, so either way it's a win-win. Jumping straight into Blender, we'll go ahead and add a new plane. We'll rotate it on the y-axis, and then we can even scale it up so we have a wider background. So I'll do BG. Then we'll go over to the materials, create a new material, we'll call it background as well, and we'll give it sort of a grayish color. Then we'll hit Shift A again, add a new plane, and this time we'll do title. So we'll go into edit mode. With everything selected, we'll delete the vertices because we're only going to be using this to generate our geometry nodes. But the way GeoNodes works is that it needs an object to be applied to because it actually works as a modifier. So let's switch over to the GeoNodes editor, and with the title selected, we'll hit New. And here we have the group input and group output. This is usually the original data of the object. And then this is what gives us the final output based on what nodes we use in between. So for now, we'll delete the group input and we'll start with the title. So let's search for string to curves. Down here, you have this string value. So let's type in minimalistic. And let me hide the background for now. And let's just plug this into the geometry. And there we have our title. But it's just a curve. For the moment, we can't really see anything if we go to the render view. So we need to fill the curve. And very conveniently, we can search for fill curve. Here we can decide to use either triangles or n-gons. As for the string to curves options, let's set the paragraph to center and middle. So now it's center aligned, and we'll set the pivot point to midpoint as well. You can use this size to increase or decrease the size of the title. You can even choose a different font if you want by clicking this folder icon and then going over to fonts and picking one here, but we'll go with the default Blender font. Now, before we continue, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So, if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. So now we have this flat title, which we can edit at any point, but we need to add some depth. So let's use the extrude mesh node right after fill curve. And let's say set the offset to about 0.4 or something like that. Now, if we look on the bottom side, we have some problems, and that's got to do with the fact that the individual button is checked. So we want to disable it so that way everything is extruded all at once, but we still have this open side at the bottom. So now what we want to do is merge the extruded mesh with the original fill curve that was sitting at the bottom. And to do that, we use a join geometry node and then just click and drag this point to the join geometry. And that's one problem down, a few more to go. Now, if we toggle the overlays face orientation, these faces at the bottom are red, indicating that the normals are facing upwards, which is not correct. So we want to flip those normals by using the flip faces. And now everything is blue, which is the correct color in this case. Another problem we created by joining the two geometries here is that these faces at the bottom and the rest of the faces are not connected. And that gives us duplicate vertices. So to fix that, we're going to use a merge by distance node, and we'll plug it right after. But as I did that, if you look at the bottom here, I'm going to mute and unmute. Nothing really changed in terms of the amount of vertices, and I can even toggle the statistics over here. And that's because we need to tell Blender first to realize or make these nodes into real geometry first, and then merge it. So that's why the merge by distance node is not working. And for that, we need to use the realize instances node before this node. So look at the statistics over here. Oops. Now, if we mute and unmute, you can see the difference. We basically get rid of 300 vertices. Now let's take a slight detour. We'll go ahead and rotate this by 90 degrees so it's facing this way. Let's create a new camera. We'll bring it over here. We can even hit Alt-R to reset the rotation and then hit RX90 so it's facing that way. Let's split the view. Then on this view, we'll hit Ctrl-0 to jump to the camera view. Then if you hit T to hide the toolbar on the side, we can hide the UI elements. Then if we go over to the camera settings, let's say 50 millimeters is fine for the focal length. Under viewport display, we'll increase the passepartout value so everything outside of the bounds of the camera becomes black so it doesn't distract us. And then on this viewport, we can click and drag it backwards a bit so we can fit the entire title, something like that. Now let's switch over to the rendered view. We'll turn the background back on. We can even rotate that to face this way and then scale it up so it fills the entire frame. And there's not a lot of lighting going on momentarily, so let's quickly add an HDRI under World Properties. Click on this colored circle, Environment Texture, hit Open, and I have this asset from polyhaven.com, which is a website that offers free 3D assets such as models and HDRIs. Maybe we can tone down the strength to about 0.35. And if we switch over to the shader editor, we can jump from object mode to world mode. And here we have our Studio HDRI. Now let me go back to the title. We'll select it under materials. Let's add a new material. We'll call it title. And we'll leave the color to be white. And we'll come back to these other settings later on once we start adding some lights and all that. But there's one thing you'll notice, and that's even though the color of the title is white and the background is gray as well, there's still some slight blue tint, and that's because of the colorization that's coming from the HDRI. So let's go ahead and search for a color ramp node and drop it in between the picture and the background. Additionally, you can select this image and hit Ctrl-T, which will add a texture coordinate and mapping node. And this is only possible if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled under Preferences, Add-ons. Search for Node Wrangler, make sure that is enabled. And then we can use this rotation value to sort of get a different angle. We can increase this strength value in the meantime. Now let me also go over to the rendered properties and we'll scroll all the way down under color management. We're using HGX as of Blender 4.0, but then we also want to give it a very high contrast on the look. And then let's go ahead and add a spotlight, which will be sort of our key light, and we'll drag it over to the side. Let's go over to the front view, and then we can hit R to rotate it like that. Can bring it up, go over to this view, maybe bring it a bit to the front, and then from the top view, we can rotate it so it faces towards the title. Now, there's not a lot of difference with and without the light, and that's because the strength is not too high. So let's go over to, let's say, about 1500 watts. And now we get some cool long shadows. We can increase the radius so we get softer shadows instead. Say a radius of 1 seems fine. And then you can even tweak the spot size, let's say about 40, so we keep the light focused a bit more. And now is the time when we can go ahead and dial the strength of the background back down. And I don't want to add color to the background or the title. I actually want to introduce color with the lights. So under the color value here, we can start doing that by pulling this over here. Let's say something like that. We could even increase it even more to, let's say, 5,000. And we might want to fill up those shadows a little bit so we can increase the strength of the HDRI, something like that. And one more thing about the light here is that you can control the intensity and the color by using either these two values, or if we switch over to the object properties under shader editor, with the light selected, we can check the use nodes button. So now we have this emission node. And if we go ahead and add a black body node and plug it into the color, this is essentially the Kelvin control. So let's say we can set it to 3200 Kelvin. So now we got this warm look, but at this point we need to tone down the saturation. So we're not using any color from this. And we could even set this back down to default, which is 10 watts, and then control the intensity with the strength value on the emission node. But I guess we'll go back and use the controls over here just because we have faster accessibility. Maybe we can add a little bit more saturation. And of course, you can play around with the hue, but that seems fine for now. We can still see the HDRI, which is kind of distracting. and we can disable that or hide it rather if we go under Render Properties, under Film, and check the Transparent box. Now, if I zoom in here, you can see there's this sort of stepping on the shading of the C letter, especially. And that's got to do, of course, with the shading of this object. But the thing is that because we're using GeoNodes to generate this title, we can't really just set this to shade smooth, auto smooth, or flat. It's just going to be flat by default. So what we have to do is fix it in the GeoNodes editor. So let's add a set shade smooth node, and we'll drop it right after the merge by distance. But now the problem is that it just sets everything to be smooth shaded, and we don't really want that. We actually want to use the auto smooth function. And the way we do that is to go into edit mode. And remember, before we deleted every vertex that was present when we created the plane originally. But let's go ahead and add a new plane. Remember, we're doing this in edit mode. We'll go ahead and hit M, merge all those vertices at center. So we're left with only this single vertex, which normally doesn't show up in the render, is just an invisible point. But that's all we need just so we can extract the data. And then in the GeoNodes, we'll search for the group input, and then we'll merge the group input with a set shade smooth by again using a join geometry. And here's a quick shortcut for you. If you hold down Control Shift and right click and drag and let go, it will join them together. And now if we zoom in, everything is looking as it should. So that's pretty much the simple solution. And in fact, let me just select all three of these nodes. We can right click, join a new frame, and then hit F2 to rename this to Shade Auto Smooth. Now, to catch the light, we need to add a bevel modifier. And as of this point, adding bevels to objects in GeoNodes is a bit too complicated. So let's go over to the modifiers tab and we'll simply add a bevel node. First, let's go down to geometry and make sure clamp overlap is unchecked. So now we can push the amount to as much as we want. So let's say 0.05 or something. We want to keep it very, very subtle. This value is so sensitive. So you can hold down Shift and Alt, and then we'll crank up the segments to about 3. Now that did screw up the shading a little bit, as you saw. So let's go over to the shading down here and just check harden normals. But now that bevel helps catch the light a lot better. All right, guys, so as far as the creation of the title is concerned, we're pretty much set and ready. But now it's just a matter of stylizing this, and then we'll do some animation, render it in the end, and do some compositing effects. For the lighting, sure, we have this spotlight as the key light. We have some fill light from each direction with an HDRI. But I want to also introduce some highlights on the bevels. And to do that, we're going to add a new light. Do area light, we'll push it back here, and we'll switch the shape to a rectangle. So now we can grab these points and scale it up horizontally like that. And I want to make it very thin and very wide. And then we'll go ahead and rotate it on the X so it's facing upwards. And we'll bring it down here like so. But now we have a few problems. We're casting a shadow from this light, so we can easily fix that. We can uncheck cast shadows. Then we're affecting the background as well, which I don't want. I want to sort of isolate the light to only affect the title. And we can do that by using a relatively recent feature in Blender, which is called light linking. Now, if we go over to the object properties while having the light selected, scroll down to the shading, we have this light linking option, and we can create a new group. Now, let's say call it title accent. And all we have to do is drag and drop the title object into this group. And that's telling now the light that only affect whatever is inside of this group, which is the title. So now if we go over to the light settings and crank this all the way up, the background is not changing, only the text is being affected by the light. Now there's still some other issue, and that's got to do with the fact that we're actually not using the material yet. This object has been generated with geometry nodes, and the way it works is we have to set the material inside of the GeoNodes editor. And here we can click, choose the title, and now we're able to notice those highlights a lot better because this is using a metallic value, a very low roughness value as well. So now if we increase this to say 25, we're going to be able to notice those highlights a lot better. Maybe we can bring it in a bit closer. Let's say lower this down to 15 watts. And then another thing is that the color of this light is not matching with the key light. So we can select the spotlight, hover over the color, hit Ctrl C to copy it, go back to the area light, Control V to paste. And now the lighting makes a bit more sense. Now we'll go ahead and duplicate this, hit X to snap it to the X axis. We'll bring it over here, hit Alt R, reset the rotation, then RY, and then we'll rotate it in that direction. And I want to kind of put it a bit upwards like that, just so it's matching the angle of the key light. But I want to use this to further accent the highlights on the bevels here. So let's see, is that doing anything for now? Maybe you have to increase the intensity. Yeah, you can notice it here on this side. Now let me go ahead and do some house cleaning before we move on to the animation and other leftover details. So first of all, let's rename this to title accent. Over here. This is spotlight key. So now everything is nice and tidy. Now, as for the animation, we can start with the title, and we can do that one of two ways. We can either animate the position or the location of the actual object, or we can add a transform geometry node, let's say either before or after the set material, and then do it over here. So we would have to animate the Z value. Now, just for efficiency's sake and so we can keep things moving a bit faster, I'm gonna delete this node and we'll animate the location over here. So that's the Y location. And what I wanna do is have the title sit inside of the background, almost flush with it, just enough so we get this sort of shadow and highlight on both sides. Let me go ahead and switch this to the timeline. We'll drag it down a bit and we'll go over to the first frame. Right click on the Y value and hit insert single keyframe so it doesn't create a keyframe for the X and Z. We don't need those. And let's say move over to 150 and let's just push it over to this side. Maybe we can look at it from a different angle. Switch over to the wireframe mode so we can see the plane. This is the plane to know just how much to push this forward. So I want it to still be intersecting with the plane, so it's sitting on top of it. And then right click, insert single keyframe again. So now we have this very simple animation. Now, if you have the mouse hovering over the timeline here, you can hit Control Tab to switch to the graph editor, select all the keyframes and then fit them to the view. Control C to copy this first keyframe and then move over to say about frame 25, which is 1 second, and then paste. So we have a full second of this title just sitting tucked in there. And then after frame 25, it slowly but surely starts moving out. And then for this one, we want to keep it linear. So just select the handle here and then hit middle mouse button to snap it to one axis and we'll just drag it over here. So now this is going to be linear. And that's the title animation done. We'll hit Shift A, add an empty. We'll do a sphere and we'll call this light rotate. Let's bring it over here under this collection. Is select all of these lights first, Control click on the light rotate last, and then hit Control P to parent to this object. So now whatever we do to this object, the lights follow along. And what I want to do is have the lighting be as it is on the final keyframe. So that's 150. I'll go over here, hit I to insert a rotation keyframe for all the axes. Then we'll go over to frame 0 and let's say rotate it so the spotlight is further away from the wall and that gives us tighter shadows so they're not going to be as long. And then maybe even rotate it this way. And then we'll do I, insert rotation, focus all of those keyframes. And in fact, let's just hit T and we'll do linear. So now these keyframes will keep on moving. So now look at this. As the title is coming out, sure, that's what's causing the shadows to become longer, but also the spotlight itself is going closer to the wall and giving us even longer shadows. And the accent lights also rotate slightly, so that might have an interesting effect on our bevel highlights. But we can do even more, and that's when the compositing comes in. So first, we'll go ahead and hit Render Image to render out a single image. So then we can move over to the Compositing tab and then check Use Nodes. Now to view what's happening, we need a Viewer node. So we'll hit Shift A, Viewer, put this over here, and then we'll drag and drop the output to this as well. And then we can move them out of the way to see what's going on. But what I prefer to do instead is to split the view, hit N to bring up the controls on the side here. Under View, we can zoom this out, maybe even use the fit button here and then zoom it back out a bit. And then we can drag these down here. And on this view, I can go ahead, hide the backdrop. Now, quick side note before we jump into it, I actually use After Effects for most of my compositing work, but for the sake of the tutorial, I wanted to keep everything built inside of Blender. Now, first things first, let me hold down Shift and right-click and drag down, and then we'll add some extra contrast by using an RGB curves node. Just make a point here. We'll add some more brightness over on that side. Then we'll add a vignette around the entire frame. And to do that, we're going to go ahead and first create an ellipse mask. And you can hit Control Shift and left click to preview that node. Again, this is tied to the Node Wrangler add-on. And now let's increase the width to something like that. Height as well. Then we can add a transform node after that. So now we can easily control the scale of this thing. And then we'll even add a blur node. Click and hold down on the X value to affect both of those values. So let's say maybe 300 or something. And now what we need to do is use this as a mask to drive another RGB curves node. So let's go ahead and hit Shift D to duplicate, drag it over here. Let me just real quick delete all of these points. Well, actually go ahead and plug the image into the image of this and then straight over there. Now I will have to click backspace on this RGB curves to reset it first. And now if I go ahead and darken this, it's going to affect the entire frame, right? But there's this factor value, which is where we plug in the mask. So now you can see that wherever there are white pixels from this mask, that's what this effect is gonna affect. But we want to invert it. We want the outer edge to be darkened as opposed to the inner part. So let's just add an invert node. So that's going to invert the color of the masks, but we also want to keep it very subtle. So let's see, with and without. It kind of focuses the attention more to the center. I'm thinking we add a hue saturation value node, crank up the saturation a little bit more, maybe 1.1, and you can even tweak the hue. So you can see how useful compositing can be because you can actually make changes in here very quickly as opposed to going back to the scene and changing the color of the lights and all that stuff. And now the final sauce is to add a glare node to introduce some fog glow. Now let me hold down Shift because the threshold value is very sensitive in this case. So we're gonna go ahead and click and hold down on it just until we start seeing some glow. Okay, there it is. Now let me switch the quality to high and we'll increase the size. Let's see what's going on here. Let me just mute and unmute. So now we have some extra glow. Now, if we go back a bit, let's say to frame 25, where things are still settled in, we can go ahead and re-render our image. Now, already I can see that something's not quite right with glow here. So let me just crank up the threshold to 0.3. So you can see this is the original, and this is the composited shot. And at this point, since we have the composite dialed in, we can go back and start actually rendering the entire animation. So remember, we want the frame range to be from 1 to 150. I'm going to be using an OpenEXR image sequence for the format. And once we have everything ready, one last thing to make sure you do before we click render animation is to disable all of these nodes in between. Because if we render it with those nodes activated, it's actually going to apply those effects and bake them into the EXR sequence. And we don't want that. We want a raw image so that we can apply those effects afterwards in the compositing. So let's go ahead and hit render animation. And once your render is complete, we can go ahead and search for it by adding an image sequence. And here I have it. Import, drag and drop it in here. And all we have to do is replace this with this. Let me go ahead and unmute all of these. Now we have an animated image sequence, which is gonna update as we scrub along. And as I mentioned before, the entire point of pre-rendering your animations and then doing extra effects in the compositing stage is that it's very forgiving to mistakes. You can say, oh, I don't quite like how the glow is looking right now. Let me go back and make changes in the compositing instead of having to re-render an entire shot. And so that concludes the minimalistic title design. All right, guys, so that was all for today's tutorial. So thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Again, you can grab the project files alongside many others from previous videos and in turn support the channel. Take care, and we'll see you next time.